and Lee, Marcus Valli, and Thor Cockroach, and they are going to be presenting to us today. And thank you very much for attending this conference. I'll start off with Marcus, and I'll be showing some of this just to be annoying. No, I'm kidding. Just to help you keep track of time.
Okay. Good afternoon. This is a joint work with Angelo and Silvio, my colleagues from the research department of the Central Bank of Brazil. It's important to emphasize that the views expressed here is in this presentation are those of the authors only, and should not be interpreted as representing the position of the Banco Central do Brasil or its board members. The motivation for this work is that the central bank has an institutional agenda related to climate risks, to macroeconomic and financial stability. This work is focused on macroeconomic impacts. The approach, the modeling approach is basically the idea is to build on a version of our DSG model, the well-known Samba model, and introduce and add new structures to address the climate issues, like green and brown energy in the model, emissions from energy, like fossil burning, using fossil burning to produce energy, and from production process, like, for example, methane from cattle. We also introduce emissions abatement efforts and endogenously, and as a trade-off between the cost of emissions. We investigated transition scenarios from like the net zero 2050 from NGFS, and we analyzed the macroeconomic performance under different regimes, policy regimes like carbon tax and cap and trade. We use data, historical data, and also some information from the future scenarios from NGFS to calibrate the model. Okay, I will show how we did that. In addition to the Samba model references, classical references, like the original working paper from Castro et al. From 2011, and a new version that we published last year, with other innovations in our model. You build on this model, inspired by some references, like, for example, the Ania Carico and Didio from 2015. They present a closed economy, new Keynesian model, embodying polluted emissions and abatement technology like we use in our model. They assess alternative environment policy regimes like carbon tax, cap and trade, and intensity target. We will be focused only on these first two. We have also some work from the ECB. More recently, actually, it's interesting to see that they obtain also, like in our model, they obtain limited economic impact from euro area and some modest trade-offs in terms of stability of inflation relative to output. This is pretty much what we obtain also. First, I need to give you some quick overview of some data from the Brazilian energy sector that is important to understand about the peculiar situation that we are in at this moment in Brazil in terms of transition. We are pretty much advanced in this issue, in special related to energy sector. We actually, if you look only electricity sector, the share of renewables is around 90%. Very different from the world scenario and scenario from the ODCE. We have seen a trend of increase of this share. We have this event here. It was a consequence of a extreme climate event that we had in 2021, when the intense draw reduced the levels of our dams, and this has impacted pretty much this share of renewables. Actually, we had a reduction in hydropower, but we turned on the thermal plants that substitute for this reduction of supply from the hydro using natural gas and oil products. And we have some elasticity here between brown and green sources of energy. If you look the capacity increase, this increase is coming from basically from solar and wind power. Actually, we had most of the increase that we observed into 2022 was come from both sectors, basically. It is a good news for us that this increase is coming from this sector. Actually, hydro is not, if you look the total energy supply, hydro is not the most important, is one of the most important, but the biggest one is the sugar biomass. We have a total of 50% of our total energy come from renewables, and these are the two most important ones. Coal, it's interesting to see that the coal dependency is reducing and is very small now. Then even if you look at the brown sector, we are a less brown sector than compared with other countries. Okay? And if you look at the scenario, the historical, you see a historical increase also, trend of increase, interrupted here. Then we are resuming the trend. Okay, it's a very different scenario compared with world and CDE, and as our model is based on per capita data, it's interesting to see that in terms of per capita emissions, CO2 emissions, in 2020 we had each Brazilian emitted like 15% compared to US citizen, 26% compared to Chinese, in 36 compared to Europe. Okay, in terms of tons of oil equivalent energy, Brazil emits equivalent to 49% compared to China, and so on. Okay, and if you look at the carbon intensity also, because of this small amount of coal, we have also this more efficient brown energy. The carbon intensity is very small. After that, we resume and talk about our model approach. The idea was to incorporate those data in our model, introducing energy production, both sectors, using green capital now, and the capital supplied by households are split in three parts now, different from the original model. And then the brown energy, now from the brown energy sector, we have emissions, And these emissions implies that the firms need to pay more because part of the energy that they use generates these emissions. We have also, at the other side, labor and productive capital, forming a composite of labor and capital that's which are an input for the intermediate production, like together with the energy, the aggregate energy that comes from both sectors here. Remember that it's 50-50 here, each sector in our calibration. At the left side, we have these emissions coming from production. The other source of emissions that it's not related to energy, to burn off fossil. It's not related to that. It's only related to the production process. And we introduced this endogenous mechanism here that brings down the abatement effort endogenously as because of this trade-off that we have between the cost of emissions that come from here that affects the decision of the firms. And we have here some inefficiency associated with these abatement efforts and that come from here, and is associated to the level of the composite output. Okay. Then all these emissions, together with the rest of the world emissions, are aggregated in global emissions that it's accumulated in this variable SE, that is the total stock of global emissions. And this generates some inefficiency here that we associate to climate change. Actually, this is not a channel that we are. It's not our focus now. It's more our focus more here and here, okay? Because we are talking more about transition. As I said, we have this aggregation, accumulation of emissions, and most important, we have our production functions that now use the composite of capital and labor and energy. J here is related to joule, the measure of energy, and the intermediate product is an aggregation of this. We use the classical constant elasticity of substitution technology with here a damage factor here, as I said. This damage factor depends on the stock, and we have elasticity here. Then we aggregate we can split our emissions in two parts, as I said. First part is brown energy, and the second part is the production, is the emissions that come from production process. We have this elasticity here that we, for simplicity, we assume to be 1 in our model. We didn't spend too much time here. And assume for simplicity that 1% of increase in input here represents 1% of emissions. Okay. Then we have our production of composite, the composite that was the input for the intermediate production as aggregation of labor and capital. And here we introduce the cost of abatement. Okay. And this is a very crucial parameter that we calibrated using the net zero scenarios from the NGFS. We calibrate this in a value like 1.3 that is sufficient to reproduce exactly the same behavior that we observe in this scenario, okay? And to analyze the effects of transition. We have climate policies. We are focused basically on tax and carbon trade. No policies it represents, this is represented by this equation here. The price of emissions is 0. And if you have a tax policy, this price, the carbon price, no, is positive. And in a cap and trade, the emissions is fixed and the price is endogenous. Okay, the difference here is exactly that here the price is fixed in the tax policy, then the emissions is endogenous, and the inverse if you are in a cap trade model. Concerning the problem of the intermediate firm, we have this new cost here, together with the cost of capital, labor, energy is new also here. This term is new in the model, but is very important for our analysis. This cost of emissions that enters here, and here we have the technological constraints with the damage functions that we introduce in the model. Basically, this is a very interesting equation that we derived. This is a first-order equation for the problem of the intermediate firm that relates the reduction that is obtained in the cost of emissions that is obtained from abatement efforts. And here at the right side, we have exactly the expression that represents the cost of abatement. Okay, the cost that related to the damage that it represents to the production. Then this coefficient here is the one that I said that we calibrate using the NGFS that relates this trade-off between these both costs. We have also the other first-order conditions that we derive that arise from this maximization problem of the firms, and we see that the demand for energy and the demand for inputs, energy and composite, energy here and composite here, it depends on the price of the products, but also on a marginal cost that appears in the problem that come from the carbon price. The carbon price increases these costs, both costs that affect demand of each other. But as it's important to emphasize that this eta E here, the elasticity of substitution between energy and labor and capital are very low. Then the firms cannot escape from the costs of the brown energy, the emissions of the brown energy, because this elasticity is very low here. This is an issue for the behavior of the model. Then we calibrate many parameters. Like I said, 50% of the fossil energy represents 50% of total emissions. The emissions of Brazil represents 3% of the world emissions, and so on. And here is the key parameter that some elasticities that this elasticity of substitution between capital and labor. We use the same that we estimated in our model, the Samba model, original Samba model. We actually use all the parameters from the Samba, the original estimated Samba model, except the new parameters that we calibrate using some data. Okay. And important to emphasize that we use a very high elasticity of substitution for energy between two types of energy, okay? Greater than ECB. ECB use like 1.8% or something like that in the work that I mentioned. We decided to use a higher level because as I said, we have this high elasticity of substitution between electricity. For example, in the electricity sector, we have this system that we can exchange brown and green sources of electricity, for example. And in other sectors, we have also this type of behavior. Then we calibrate our model, as I said, to generate the same. The green squares here represent the NGFS scenario for 5 years ahead. And we calibrate the models such that the increase in carbon price generates the same reduction, for example, here on emissions coming from production process, for example. Okay? Then we calibrate the model to generate the same results in the first 5 years. Then we have our impulse responses, and I'm finished in 1 minute. The basic idea is here to analyze both types of policies. Actually, the macro behavior is the same for both. We obtain that the macro effects are the same, exactly the same for both types of policies. And we observe that the increase here of emissions, we introduce a permanent shock on the price on carbon prices here, and fix this carbon price, for example, in this blue line here, and we obtain a decrease of GDP, an increase in inflation, and a reaction from the monetary policy. But we didn't see, we can't see any transition here. We see only a reduction of the emissions from the production process, but we not observe a reduction, a substitution between green and fossil energy, because, as I said, the elasticity, the decision of the firms in order to escape from the cost of emissions does not allow to change the source, the inputs of that are used from the brown and green sector to produce the total energy. Oh, excuse me. And here we introduce a shock on investments, on green investments, and see that here this shock provides a transition between both energies here. We see an increase in green energy and reduction of fossil energy, and the impacts on prices of energy, and impacts on inflation and in GDP. But we observe that an increase on GDP here, because this is an increase on energy supply that provides more an increase in GDP. To conclude, here we simulate 15 years of a transition as they compared with using exactly the same increase in the emission price, in the carbon price. Here these 3 points here are the points that represents the level of carbon price of the net zero scenario. We produce exactly the same, and see that a reduction in the consequence in terms of a reduction of production process emissions, and see and also introduce a shock on investments to reproduce exactly the same scenario here in terms of increase of green energy and reduction of fossil, and analyze the effects on prices and the macro effects also. And we see that the impact is positive in terms of GDP because this shocks on investment. Remember that we are using two types of shocks. We see an increase in GDP, increase in inflation, despite of the increase of inflation and the reaction of the monetary policy. I will conclude here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marcus. So without further delay, I'll invite Ann Lee to discuss.
Okay, great. First, let me thank the organizer for a great invitation. Pleasure to be here. It's been a privilege for me to discuss this paper, a great paper, and I enjoy reading it a lot. So first, let me summarize the motivation, also the question, and few key result of the paper. So we know that climate change and emission reduction remain one of the top priority, not only for Brazil, but for the rest of the world. And the question the paper tried to answer is what are the implications of emission policy for Brazilian economy, and what is the role of green investment, and also stimulate the NGFS scenario. So the paper attributes to enrich a work-hard ESG model for Brazilian economy called Samba with energy sector and environmental variable. And then they build up energy production sector under perspective of Brazil and conduct main policy analysis, including green investment enhancement. So I think Marcos did a great job in presenting it, so and I cannot support it in any sense. So I just highlight here two of most appealing results to me, is that 30% reduction in emission in 5 years using carbon policy do not induce a green transition and cause non-significant cost in terms of GDP. And the model predicts a less desirable relationship between the price of emission and emission reduction compared to NGFS, and I actually put it here. When you have emission reduction is not on point with the green line from the NGFS. So that brings me to two main comment and one minor one, if I may. The first comment is about the uncertainty in macroeconomic effect and bring in the need of estimation of the model. So you can see here is that one type of emission around here, around 40%, almost 40%, and the cost in GDP is mostly negligible, like minus 0.09%, I could say. Of course, I could be grateful and be more than happy to see they actually happen, but for me, it's a bit too positive or optimistic in this case. And I look into literature, so that the output loss seems too small compared to other papers. The first one is from a report from ECP, Brand et al. 2023, when they simulate using carbon price to cut off emission. And this uncertainty document through their 7 model, including CGE and the HGE model, and as well as semi-structural model. And you can see their report is like the median response, which is the yellow light, around 0.8% output loss, and only cut around 10% of emission. Also, another paper with me from me and my co-author that we enriched 29 DHE model with environmental aspect, including work-up model of Smith and Guter, and we simulate the rise of carbon price, so that emission cut by 40%, and you can see the uncertainty is quite high. And this is for one sector model, so I could expect more in output loss, but still nothing more or less close to the paper. I understand that some parameter is calibrated to match the NGFS scenario, but then maybe it's highly interesting to see how the estimation play the role here, given that the macroeconomic part of the model is estimated because it's a workhorse model of the Brazilian central bank. And also the model play a role as a policy model for the BCP. So I think the quantitative aspect of the model is kind of important here. However, to do it properly, then the challenging or the challenge lies in the preservation of the nonlinearity within the model, because we're talking about a permanent introduction of a permanent rise in carbon price, which we should observe some nonlinearity there. So I propose some promising method, first from PME on 2023, when they can do it with maximum likelihood estimation. And the recent paper of Sahuk around 2023 using Taylor and Fair 1983 to do a Bayesian estimation. So that's top two candidate if you want to fully estimate the model and compare with the NGFS scenario. The second comment is more light because I find the paper highly interesting and maybe many venues to develop. So about distributional implication and also about the role of monetary and fiscal policy in this kind of scenario. So from reading the paper, I see that there are rule of thumb household ensemble model that I can have myself to think about fiscal policy, including transfer and subsidy. And why it's important? Because the literature highlights the distributional effect of this kind of carbon policy risk among different household and firm. And I cite some paper that to the best of my knowledge. So it's highly interesting to look into fiscal policy with the distributional implication, let's say to protect the most vulnerable household in this kind of sense. And then the paper, still have a lot of venue to see the role of the central bank here by optimal policy, or even more interesting in the sense of optimal monetary fiscal interaction. Similar to the paper, you cited already by Conan et al. 2023. It brings me to my last comment. It's minor about nonlinearity effect. It's not clear to me whether the model is so with nonlinear, fully nonlinear or not. However, recent results highlight the importance of nonlinearity in explaining both the post-COVID inflation and mid-inflation during after the global financial crisis. And one of the most promising way to deal with it is that because the policy model, they always work with linearized model. And it's interesting, important for central bank to take care of inflationary effect, right? We don't really see it here with the carbon price. And I wonder, like, maybe it's actually amplified when you bring in some nonlinearity inside the model. And I say, like, Harding et al. 2023, and Harding et al. 2023, that use Matt and Guter paper with the Kimball calculator and solid nonlinearity. And I find that, well, inflation can be kicked in really fast if your initial state is already high. So this may be something that the Central Bank of Brazil care about. But let me conclude. Anyway, it's great and well-developed paper, and the topic is highly interesting and important for Central Bank for sure. And I understand it's still in, let's say, early state, and there's a lot of interesting venue to build up, and I'm looking forward for more extension from your work. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Lee. Marcus, would you like to reply?
Thank you, Anne, for your comments. excuse me. Actually, the estimation is a challenge. I tried a lot to trying to find out a way to estimate, but the data we don't have to make much data, and the difficulties is very high, and then we decided to come to this strategy to use the estimated model, the estimated parameters from the regional model, and calibrate the other parameters. This is really a limitation that we will be trying to figure out how to handle. About the small effects, it's important to emphasize. Actually, the effects are small, and the effects we obtain combining these two types of shocks was that we obtain actually a positive impact on GDP, because basically because we reproduce the sum of the transitions variables, the behaviors of some transition variables from the net zero of the NGFS. But remember, we have this small substitution elasticity between capital and labor and energy. This is an issue because the firms cannot escape from these costs coming from the energy sector. Then the implication is that the increase of carbon tax affects only results in only a reduction in the emissions coming from the production process only, but not from the energy sector emissions. Then we decided to combine, to reproduce the transitions, combining two types of shocks, but then we decided to use the investment shocks to reproduce the transition in the energy sector. But this shock is positive in terms of GDP. Then we have the first one, the increase of carbon tax reduce GDP, and the investments on green energy increase GDP. Then the result of these two impacts are that the GDP increases in our calibration. Okay, and this is a justification because of this small effect and positive effect on GDP. About the fiscal policy interactions, we actually, this is one thing that we are planning to investigate more, to use the resources that is collected from carbon tax, use it to be transferred to specific sectors or families. This is an issue that we need to explore in the future. And about non-linearity, it's another issue that's very complicated. We don't have we don't have a second order approximation of our original model, Samba model. This is a challenge to have one. Then, if we decided to explore more this issue, we need to try to solve this limitation. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Marcus. Do we have any question from the audience? Okay, so Professor Lee, I think your presentation is already.
Yep. Let me see if I can work on it. One minute. I think I can work it out. Right? Okay. All right. So again, thank you so much for including my paper. So the title is Climate Change Carbon Policy, a story of optimal green macro potential and capital flow management. So the paper is really close to what Marcos already did a great job in presentation. So, but the motivation is that I hope I don't need to motivate a lot because we all know about the Paris Agreement. Among many other come out with the goal to keep the global temperature rise under 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius compared to pre-industrial level. And among many other solutions on the table, rather waiting for a huge innovation in green technology, we also have what already been there for a while, carbon pricing or tax. However, carbon pricing is not a silver bullet because it may cause macroeconomic risk and commonly called transition risk in the literature. So what's the paper try to question? The paper tried to question that what's the transition bed look like in different scenarios of carbon price implementation or designs. And then when we observe that this transition risk, we step into the policy maker's shoe, and in this case is the central bank shoe, that we ask can a short set of monetary credit and macroprudential policy can be designed to assist the transition path, or we need to create a completely new things to deal with this new risk. And for that, the paper tried to focus on two cases. The immediately cut of emission between 25 to 50%, and we big 40% emission cut of GHG emission as suggested by one of the report by the IMF. And the second is the net zero emission economy by 2050 using increasing carbon price. So if you are tired of because of a long day, let me wake you up with some review of the main finding. So the paper contains two parts. We have a small part which is the empirical motivation using the Euro area data, which carbon policy shock actually taken from EU ETS platform. And then the empirical motivations show that they show recessionary effect, financial instability, and notably a location effect. But in the sense, it push the green sector and dampen the brown sector. And the main part of the model of the paper actually developed a medium large scale two-sector macro financial model to conduct scenario analysis. So our model predicts a 0.7% output loss for 40% emission reduction and 2% output loss at the bottom for the net zero economy by 2050. And we are play around on how to implement the best of carbon price. And we find out that pronouncement effect in the sense that you communicate the introduction of big carbon price ahead of actually do it can mitigate inflation volatility by 0.2% at a peak. And lastly, the financial sector actually amplified the effect of transition risk. So there are two key points that we observe here. The first thing is that a location effect of carbon price. The second is the role of financial sector in this scenario. So in the third part, we do some optimal policy by maximizing welfare inside the economy. And we find that the optimal heterogeneous reserve requirement at a form of macroprudential policy show the most welfare gain by allocating more green capital to mitigate the output loss by 0.1% and investment loss by 0.5% compared to the baseline. Why this is the case? So the intuition is simple. We observe a location effect. However, monetary policy should not be designed to create any heterogeneous effect by default. And then macroprudential policy and in here reserve requirement step into exactly that play to complement the monetary policy. And lastly, we also do some optimal carbon price reaction. And show that the traditional way of maximizing household welfare is not working there because the carbon price should be, by nature, create welfare loss. And lastly, with a small extension to step into the shoe of the country, that have like active capital inflow control or capital flow control management, control active. We also do the same thing for foreign capital, and we find that it also promotes green transition, but with the cost with welfare gain, actually. So what the paper does? So the paper mainly build a medium large scale two-sector DHE model with financial friction. So we have green and brown sector with carbon price, payment cost, actually working in a working capital constraint in the sense that we assume that the firm have to borrow to finance their activity, including paying for capital costs, wage to labor, and carbon price, carbon costs, payment costs. And financial friction or working capital constraint actually checking between firm and bank and checking from seminal work from Bernanke until 1999. And because we have the banking sector, we can put in the reserve requirement or macroprudential policy on lending to green and brown sector, and this bring us to the optimal policy. And we analyzed through mainly three scenarios: 40% emission reduction immediately and completely surprise, zero net emission by anticipated, well communicated carbon price, and forward guidance in carbon policy in the sense that you pre-announce of your carbon price introduction. And then lastly, we do optimal policy to deal with institutional risk, and a TFP and also TFP shock to determine optimal carbon price. So I will go through the literature for the sake of time. So let's take a look at empirical motivation. So with using euro area and the carbon policy shock from Kansas 2023. So obviously you see it's keep echoing the result from Kansas is that the recessionary effect of this carbon policy shock. By bringing down GDP, consumption, rise up unemployment rate, and we observe inflationary effect, which is commonly called greenflation. And of course, let's bring down emission here. What I want to see with the data is financial variable. So here we also see that it's also create financial instability using your favorite or my favorite measurement of financial stability, including financial stress, credit spread in the market, and stock index. So, and for sure investment, but by all of the index or measurement show financial instability, which give a hint for the role of financial sector in this kind of scenario. And lastly, to distinguish and to see whether it have a location effect or not, so we use ETF data. We control by putting the energy sector SPDR. So this is the ETF data for most of energy firm. And VanEck vector code by the name is the measurement of the brown sector. And I said clean energy is the measurement of clean sector. And you obviously here is that the dampen in the brown sector and the push in the green sector is quite significant. So with all of this, we try to take it into the model, the DHE model, as much as possible. So for the people who are not really familiar with the fields, so this is a snapshot of the paper. So we have the household who consume and work, supply labor, and they can save by deposit to the green lending bank and brown lending bank. The big assumption here is green bank lend to green firm and brown bank lend to brown firm. And how to bring environmental aspect or environmental variable into the model. We assume that only brown firm produce good with a byproduct, which is emission. And then they can pay some cost to clean it, called a payment cost. And then the rest over is subject to carbon price. The leftover emission will accumulate into what we call emission stock or pollution. And this pollution will cause a damage into productivity for every firm inside the economy. And the rest of the model is more or less standard. We have the wholesale firm to set price and then give price to inflation and produce a final good that you for consumption. So that's just a model in a nutshell. So what I actually enrich into the model. So there are only two slides of equation here. The first is how the intermediate goods sector or production sector actually look like. So they use the labor from the household and entrepreneur labor, which is the management. You can understand as a manager of the firm, and the capital from the household. And they have the AIT EMV here is the level of productivity level that also be affected by the pollution. So IMV here is the damage function to exogenous productivity level. That's actually the function of XT. XT here is the pollution level inside the economy. And how pollution accumulates slowly. From first emission, ET here is domestic emission, and emission rate of the world that named ROW. And emission is actually the function of the production of, it's just a byproduct of private sector. And what the contribution here is that the introduce of working capital. So working capital of green firm, including the net worth, so you own equity, you are the owner of firm, you own some equity, and the remaining of thing you go to the bank to borrow it, which named BGT is the borrowing of the green firm. And they use this to finance the operation, including the wage for both kind of household and paying the cost of capital. Let's say for the factory, so to speak. And what's different compared to the brown firm? The brown firm had to pay the extra carbon price and the payment cost that increase with carbon price, and they are subject to. They also have to borrowing to finance these two kind of things. The ZT is the payment cost that they pay to clean a part of emission, and the ET here, the tau TE times ET, actually the total cost of carbon price. The ET is emission and tau TE is the carbon price. Having said that, banks are subject to macroprudential policy, so they create a question of financing rate RGT and RPT compared to the risk-free rate set by central bank. Notably, why this important track? Because for green firm, this is the maximization for decision of lending. So the fraction of bankruptcy remaining to the owner of the firm, they maximize it. It's a profit of the firm, and the way the bank lend to you is that in the case of bankrupt, the part that they receive back from the firm needs to be larger or equal to the cost of lending of financing for the bank. And importantly, how the model track on the way of the cost of environmental. So here I define the cost of environmental to profit of the firm as cost ET here. And this cost actually get into the maximization problem or the decision-making process of the bank. So the bank know that you have to pay extra when they decide to give a loan to you. And they anticipate it when the price or the policy introduced. Do I run over time? Okay, great. So I will not step into calibration, but here is how the model fits to data of euro area. So for standard deviation, the model match quite well to the main macroeconomic model of the euro area, even this calibrated model. So can say with some certain of confidence that we can have some indication from the model. So first I show you unanticipated introduction of carbon tax policy to achieve 40% emission. So emission reduce immediately 40%, which is high in carbon price. And you imagine this is fully unanticipated. So if you imagine this that you sleep today and you wake up tomorrow morning and that big carbon price already there. And the base model is our model, and the red line actually model exactly the same thing. I just take away all of the banking sector, all the way financial friction, on the way of working capital constraint. And you obviously see here is that for the model with the banking, there are amplification effect. We keep echoing the result from empirical motivation, that's the drop in GDP, investment, consumption, and also the kick in inflation here. Of course, we observe for sure the allocation by boosting the green output here. So this is a permanent policy, so it's shift the economy into so-called new steady state, but technical term is not a new steady state. So brown output is forever moved to the new place, and of course the pollution decrease slowly. So how the net zero emission can be achieved with this model? So emission, to do a net zero emission economy, we keep rising the carbon price linearly until it's reached the 100% cut in emission by in next 30 years from now. So this is quarter 120. So again, GDP, investment, consumption, more or less keep echoing the previous story. The only big difference is that you don't observe any inflationary effect here. Why? Because now if you anticipate the introduction or keep increasing of carbon price, you anticipate that your income gonna drop in the future and keep dropping until they reach the 100% cut of emission. By that, you reduce your demand immediately from day one. So that's why inflation is just simple. It's the difference between supply and demand. So demand now drop significantly more. That bring down the inflation. That kill all of the inflationary effect. And also more or less everything is stay the same. So with this observation, we try to play a role to see like how the pre-announcement or communication before introduction of carbon price play a role. So the blue line is exactly the same thing, but the black line is like we communicate that we're gonna introduce the carbon price in the 5th period, but everyone in the economy know it from the 0 period, so they know it 4 quarters in advance. And you can see immediately here they reduce emission, they cut down the demand immediately. That bring deflationary effect when the production sector not yet feel the heat of rising carbon price, in the sense that rising the marginal cost, that they produce everything which higher cost. So that's everything for the scenario analysis. For optimal policy, we maximize the welfare and solve the model with second order approximation with pruning method. What we try to optimize, we optimize the reaction in Taylor rule to inflation rate and the raw GDP. Notably that our reserve requirement is the reaction function to the change in total credit in the market. So it's really similar to Basel III practice. And we determine all of this parameter here by maximizing the welfare, the utility inside of the household, inside the economy. And the results say that this is the benchmark model, and the model when we only optimize the Taylor rule. And when we try to optimize everything, we see that there are significant response in green macroprudential, and we find non-significant response in the reserve requirement of the brown sector, the 5B here. And for sure, the welfare gain in this case is the most significant. And then what it look like in the graph. So the same exercise, now I replace the parameter that we just figured out by trying to optimize everything. The black line is only the Taylor rule optimize, and the red line is Charlie optimal, and you obviously see the effect. So I want to highlight why we do it. You see here is that green capital, green output is significantly different between the red and the other 2 lines. So like I already mentioned, monetary policy can have heterogeneous effect, but should not be designed to create heterogeneous effect. And the macroprudential policy in this case actually put the hand in exactly that place. So we do the same thing with we open up the economy, and we allowed for foreign investment or foreign capital inflow. And we do the same thing there, subject to domestic response to credit. And again, we do the same, more or less, exercise, but here the welfare is much less, or even the welfare loss when we try to force the model actually to have some positive response or non-negative response of capital control. The reason is that this capital control policy actually attract more green capital from approach. And by that, it will create a distortion to the deposit you actually put into the firm, because it's now a competitor to your deposit. So bank can choose to use your deposit to finance the operation, or just foreign capital to do it. And this, the household doesn't like it at all. And then the same thing, I put the parameter there. And here, most of that is, more or less the same story, but much of the effect is not there compared to what we have done with domestic capital. So for concluding remark, so few takeaway. So empirical motivation suggests a recessionary effect, the role of financial sector, and also allocation effect of this carbon policy. The model keep echoing that, but then we find out that if you want to introduce that giant carbon price, you should do it with pronouncement, well communicated in advance, because it at least mitigate the inflation volatility. Having said that, we observe allocation effects, so we need something to deal with it, and monetary policy at the certain stage cannot be designed to create that effect. So one of the candidates here, green reserve requirement, that we already, our reserve requirement in general, we already have there inside the toolbox, inside the hand of central bank community, and just we need to bring it back and redesign it to deal with it. And yeah, so the last slide I will not repeat. So that's from my side. Comment is welcome, and thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Lee. I would like to invite Thor to comment.
Okay, so hi. First, thanks first of all to the organizers for having me here, for including my paper in the program, for having me discuss this paper. I'm going to discuss An's paper, Impact of Carbon Policy on Economic Dynamics. It's a very rich paper. I can recommend it if you're interested in this kind of topics to read it. There's a lot to learn, and I learned a lot. So first, the summary of the paper. The objective of the paper is to examine the macro-financial impact of a carbon tax as an instrument to transition to a greener economy, so with lower emissions, essentially. So what they find is that if you do this in an unanticipated way, introduce the carbon tax to reduce the carbon emissions by 40%, that leads to roughly 0.7% output loss and 0.3% rise in inflation. If you do it in a gradual way and towards zero emissions in the end, over the span of 30 years, then you would have a 2.7% lasting output loss. And then there are further exercises where you anticipate this change, and especially in the latter part, there's a lot about optimal rules for macroprudential policy, for monetary policy, for those two combined. There's extension for open economy and capital control. So as I said, there's a lot. What they find in these extensions in the latter part, so the carbon tax also increases financial instability and triggers a shift in the sectors, so the green and the brown sectors, towards the green production. And in this open economy, the capital controls, they don't improve welfare. So how do they go about? Well, they lay it out nicely. There's first an empirical part, and then there's a model part. In the empirical part, they use Bayesian local projections, and then in the model part, they lay out a new Keynesian DSGE model with the environmental aspects. So in the first, in the empirical part, they find, using these Bayesian local projections, that regulatory changes, which then lead to higher emissions allowances prices, they would lead to lower GDP and higher inflation. So there's literature which came before this paper, which already looked into this. Contribution here is a more robust way of finding this, which I think is a nice way to contribute to literature and motivate this. Then the theoretical model. So it's, I mean, there are multiple versions, but the baseline version is the following. It's a closed economy model. There are households, firms, a government, a central bank, and a macroprudential authority. The firm structure is the following. You have intermediate goods firm, wholesale firm, and retail goods firm. The intermediate goods firm, there's the green and the brown firms. I mean, just to be clear, green firms, they don't emit, brown firms, they emit. They're capital goods, there's labor, which is used, and there are defaultable loans here as well. And the wholesale firm then aggregates these inputs from the green and the brown firms, and then the retail firm aggregates the goods from the wholesale firm. There's some nominal frictions and thereby a role for monetary policy. Then the environmental and economic impacts. So that's where sort of the emissions come in and also the abatement. So the brown firms, they generate emissions as a byproduct, which can be abated, so avoided if you like. Okay. And are subject to a carbon tax. So that's the what is center here in this study. And ultimately, there's a productivity impact. So when you're emitting a lot, the total factor productivity goes down essentially, but it's slowly decaying as a function of the emissions slowly decaying in the atmosphere. So here I'm going to show one and sort of the main impact, if you like. So the carbon tax pushes up the costs for brown goods, which I think is quite obvious and direct, and leads sort of to substantially lower emissions, but mostly via emissions abatement. So by investing in technologies to avoid essentially these emissions. So the carbon tax is inflationary, almost directly in essence. It also makes the brown sector less competitive, but then so there's a production function which keeps the value share constant. So actually the adaptation of the economy is not by sort of a structural change of the economy, because that is by construction essentially is kept constant, but it's rather on the margin of the abatement. And then since the carbon tax is a distortionary tax, I mean, also almost by definition that leads to lower output. Now, some comments. I have a few, I mean, two main comments and then some minor comments. So the first comment is like, what is driving the transition? So here we look at what if it's the carbon tax which is driving the transition, but in this case it's also directly, I would argue, driving the results, because it is a distortionary tax, and that sort of, you cannot improve, you only make it worse in a sense, and that is what we see. That is what is lowering output, of it's lowering welfare, and it's cost push inflation essentially. But what about other explanations which could drive the transition? I mean, I know it's a bit of a cheap comment, but in the end I would say there might be other explanation which might drive the transition. Why is the carbon tax a good one? So I'm referring mostly to the paper here. So I think that would be nice to lay out why the carbon tax should be the means by which you achieve essentially this transition. The second comment is about how does the post-transition economy look like? So here we have a greening of the brown economy, or a greening of the brown sector, if you like, and or a reorganization of the value chain. So here it's actually mostly greening of the brown economy, so abatement, if you like, because of the CS production function, which applies to constant value shares. And we see small adjustments, yes, in the relative sector outputs, but the shares will be constant. So in a sense then, if the brown sector is investing in technologies to avoid emissions and becomes more similar to the green sector, what is the difference then between this greener brown sector and the green sector? So if in the limit of zero emissions, they're the same, what is the structure of the economy? Do we still need this production function of combining the two goods, which formerly were brown and green, and which are now, well, a greened brown and a green? Because that has consequences for the results, essentially. So those are the two main points, and there are also some suggestions, but this is mostly pertaining to the paper, actually. But it would be nice to see the contribution of abatement, even if it's small, but just to see to what extent it contributes to the results. To see also the carbon tax equivalent price per ton of emissions. I mean, another way of achieving the transition is, for example, through cap and trade. I mean, here we talk about carbon tax, but you could make this sort of relatable by showing the equivalent price per ton of emissions. And ultimately the benefit of lower emissions on TFP. I mean, that is the channel through which it comes back, but it would be nice to see that and to what extent that contributes. And then the last point here would be good. Would it make easier to follow if there would be complete problem definition, first order conditions? This is only the model. The model diagram, I mean, I wrote it here, but he had it in the slide, so I think they should be in the paper as well. The steady state values along the transition path. I mean, we're talking about a transition here. What are the steady states at the beginning? What are the steady states in the end? What is the sensitivity of the steady states with regard to parameters? And also lay out the methods and algorithms for each scenario and what they imply. I think in terms of exposition, that would just make it, would be helpful. And then lastly, some minor comments. So the optimal carbon tax, so they're essentially, they pick a welfare function and they add essentially a component relating it to emissions. But in a sense, to what extent is this driven by the choice of exactly this? So there's some robustness, I think, would be helpful. Then optimal capital controls. So here, essentially, they write the extension with an open economy, their capital controls, okay. And then they say, fine, let's find the best, I mean, the optimal policy, first without capital controls. They find a certain value, and then they optimize with capital controls. But my intuition would tell me, okay, if you optimize starting from essentially the results you find in the previous step, and you just say capital controls are not active, then that is the baseline, and you can only improve on that, or you don't. But the result is a bit puzzling, that essentially the result is worse there than compared to the result with only the Taylor rule. And then lastly, macroprudential rules. It would be nice if they could be motivated in some sense, but those are minor comments. Overall, I enjoyed reading the paper, and yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Tor. And would you like to make comments?
Yeah, great thanks to Tor for great discussion. Let me quickly respond to some points. So you make a great point about what's right, the transition rate, maybe the carbon price not that bad. maybe the household actually favor it. So it's actually a good question, but then how you bring it into the model is subject to huge discussion due to lack of micro founded how the people anticipate carbon price in their daily life. So we know that the household hack pollution, but I'm not sure that every one of you in this room check emission daily and then feels like dislike it when you see it. And then emission measurement is measured daily is not that accountable, because someday you have the high emission and someday you have low emission. So that's I'm looking forward for innovation in the micro-founded microfield in how people anticipate the carbon price. The second point is that you make it completely true is that no endogenous shift in the share of brown output. So that's something that I also looking to work in the future for, let's say, endogenous reduction inside of the brown sector also. Yeah, so the optimal carbon tax and all the optimal policy just follow the literature in maximizing the welfare. Of course, I mean, if you bring in the welfare, such as like they also including such as emission, that what I did for determine optimal carbon price, then of course they do favor increase in carbon price. But I stick to literature on this. Yeah, this good point, appetite control. First, I think we charted a little bit before, is that we do have some constraint on non-positive or negative capital control. So, and then force the household to optimize that, which turned out to be not really optimization, or not optimized because it create welfare loss compared to only the tail rule. And then, but appreciate the discussion. Thank you a lot.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Lee. Do we have any questions from the audience? Please go ahead.
Thank you. You could, if you increase a carbon tax, if you implement a carbon tax, you could lead the local companies to import the intensive carbon products. So you wouldn't have an effect on the earth. You would have an effect just on the country. So I could imagine that the carbon tax could be implemented not only on the local companies, but also as an import tax. So it could have this effect on forcing the local companies to be green at all, not only in the products they produce locally, but also on the products they have to import. I'm adding this because I think this your paper could be have a contribution from the other paper in this aspect of effects from other countries.
Great. Thanks a lot. For sure, I have thought about it a lot. So this paper is a closed economy, so we cannot have that. But for sure, that I more than encourage you to get into the literature. The more or less a few people only working in this kind of fields to highlight the indication of what we see CBAM in Euro area. And also, I guess one of the policy note, to the best of my knowledge, from Asian Development Bank, just recently out a few months ago, how inefficiency of this CBAM, given the transition cost of this, we're sending a team to investigate the foreign firm whether they pollute or not, and how much they produce emission, which creates a lot of transition costs, admin costs. But there's a literature on that. But I greatly appreciate your comment.
Thank you very much. Thor, would you like to? Presentation. Perfect, thank you.
Okay. Yeah, so thanks again for selecting this paper and inviting me here. Excited to be here, talk with you about research and being in Brazil for the first time. So now I'm going to talk about green and brown returns in a production economy. So this is a joint project with a colleague at the European Central Bank and another colleague at the Bundesbank, so usual disclaimer applies. This is our views and our errors and not the ones of our employers. So what question do we try to tackle here is, does it pay to invest in green stocks? So this essentially has implications for the green transition. If you think about investing or investment firms, pension funds, and so on, if they invest in such assets. So that is just to motivate the overall topic. But it's also academically, there's quite a debate about this. Is there a carbon premium? Is there a green premium? So are the returns of polluting firms higher than the returns of non-polluting firms? And some say that the firms with high emissions, they actually earn higher returns. But then on the other hand, theoretically, you could say like, well, actually there are many, if you think about, for example, sovereign wealth funds who try to push and not invest into firms which are polluting a lot. So they're reluctant to hold it. And if they're reluctant to hold it, then, well, they probably should be remunerated for it. So there are mechanisms here which can justify a green or a brown premium, a green or a carbon premium. Also in the literature, which is mostly based on empirics, there are some like Bolton and Kaberchik which argue for a carbon premium, but they say this is mostly related to transition risk, the fact that we're transitioning towards a greener economy, but others, Bauer et al. And Aswani, who argue there's a green premium actually. What we do is we look at empirical evidence for the EU, and we do find a green premium actually. And then we lay out a model and we evaluate different theoretical mechanisms which could explain it. So let's go straight to the results. We find that essentially a well-functioning emissions trading scheme, as well, I would argue it's well-functioning, the emissions trading scheme, which is in place in the EU, explains the green equity premium which we observe in the data. How so? Well, it's because this carbon pricing smoothes the profits and dividends of brown firms. So the mechanism here is the following. So there's the cost of these carbon permits, as they're called, and the brown firms have to pay for them. So the polluting firms have to pay for them. The green firms don't. So now if you go through a business cycle and you go through a boom, for example, then many people want to produce. If many people want to produce, you're also going to pollute, and then the price of these carbon credits goes up. So usually in a boom, you would be more profitable, so your profits will be higher. You would also be able to pay more dividends. But now if you're a polluting firm, you have to pay for these carbon credits, and they become more expensive in a boom. So in a boom, your profitability and your dividends is actually not that high anymore. So it's kind of dampening. But also in the downturn, in a recession, less people want to produce, so the price of these carbon credits goes down. So also there sort of, or in that case, it helps you a little, but over the business cycle, essentially it dampens the profitability of these firms. And by the profitability, also the dividends, which they give to investors. And that essentially means, as an investment, these firms are less risky because their profits and their dividends, they're more stable, more predictable. And since they're less risky, you also get less return. So essentially, the fact that there is an emissions trading scheme in place leads to the emitting firms being less risky and having lower returns compared to the green firms. And that's why you have a green equity premium. So this is the theoretical mechanism we lay out. And then given this, and given that you model it, there are also some things we can say based on the model. So in our model, the green equity premium which we observe in the data is consistent with a price of around 70 euros per ton of carbon. If you look at the current price of the ETS, of the emissions trading scheme, it's around that, roughly. But then there are also other explanations. I mean, it could be that there is a preference for green financial assets, but that, we argue, is a less likely explanation. So the literature, I'm not going to go through all of this, but essentially there are different strands of literature, which are, the first part here is more empirical, and they try to argue, okay, is there a green or a carbon premium? That's conflicting. Then there's another part of the literature which is more relevant to the papers we've seen before, where they try to model sort of the interaction of the business cycle and the environmental policy. There's a more green finance and macro-based literature. And ultimately, since we are concerned here about financial returns and assets, we also relate to this literature, but our contribution is really putting them all together and say, okay, we want to tackle the question of green and brown, green premium or carbon premium, and we want to do this model-based. So going to the empirics, so we use data from different sources from 2012 to 2022. So one is on carbon emissions. The other one is information on the individual firms. So we look at individual firms, their returns, their market capitalization, their net sales. We have the emissions allowances prices, which is quoted, and then simply macroeconomic data. The interesting part really is, how do you sort of measure the returns of a green or brown portfolio? So in order to do that, we have to construct this portfolio based on all this information about all of these firms. So what we do is we take all of these firms and sort them by their scope 1 emissions. And then we call essentially the firms, the green firms are sort of the ones with the lowest 10%, and the brown firms are the one with the most emitting 10%. And then we weight them by their market capitalization. So we weight the returns by the market capitalization, and we sort of resort every year in Q3, essentially. So that's how we produce the data series. Now, having done that, then you can look at the returns, and here is the data series we use, essentially. And what you find there is that, I mean, you see it in the lines, but it's easier if you calculate the statistics. So the average return is actually higher for the green equity portfolio by about 200 basis points. But then the other part, since our mechanism works through the volatility and the riskiness, also the standard deviation is interesting here. And there we also find that the green equity portfolio is more volatile compared to the brown one. But I mean, at the current state, it's also the case that the brown firms tend to be larger than the green firms. So that is something to bear in mind. Now, the mechanism I laid out in the beginning implies certain things which you should see in the data, such as, for example, the carbon price should be pro-cyclical, right? So as I said, okay, during the boom, everybody wants to produce and wants to buy these carbon credits, would imply that it's pro-cyclical. So here we just took the data and said, like, okay, do we find these correlations in the data? And yes, so in the here, do you see that? Yeah. So here you see that there's a positive relationship between this emissions trading scheme price and the GDP growth. And then the second part of the mechanism is actually about this profit smoothing for the emitting firms. So that would imply that the that if the carbon price moves, then also the sort of the relative performance of the green and the brown firms, that should react in a similar way. And that's also what we find that is sort of the second column. Also in that case, there's a positive correlation. In essence, it's confirming sort of, the data is confirming what we think how this mechanism should work. We do this exercise for 2 time periods because, I mean, here you have to bear in mind the emissions trading scheme in the EU was implemented in different phases, which had an influence on the price. And also the Russian invasion of Ukraine had a substantial influence on energy prices. So that's why we do it twice here for different time periods, but it holds for both time periods. Now the model. I would say it's a fairly simple model, but I made a fairly complicated chart. I'll walk you through. So it's essentially, we have households and firms. And the firms can be further subdivided into the emitting firms and the non-emitting firms, so the brown firms and the green firms. And then what the green and the brown produce, or what they produce, that is then combined by the final goods sector and is sold to the households. So there are different markets here, if you like. So the green and the brown producer, I mean, they use labor from the household, they use a capital good, so machines. They're being financed by the household, so their bonds, there's also equity. And then they get the respective returns, like capital lease, dividends, wages, and so on. And they buy the goods from the firms, so the households buy the goods from the firms. What's different between the brown producer and the green producer is actually only these emissions. So they emit, and they have to buy these pollution permits, so the emissions trading scheme. And then there's only one shock in the economy, and there are certain frictions which matter. So on the one hand, there's the loss due to emissions. So there's here, it's not modeled as a sort of reduction in productivity, but it's just a straight out loss in output for the households, essentially. There are bond issuance costs, so that is on the financing side. There's portfolio adjustment costs, which is also on the financing side. Dividend smoothing. So these are important, essentially, to match the model to the data. Since we're concerned with returns, like those are crucial frictions in order to ensure that this model essentially makes sense, given the data. So to further highlight some key ingredients here, so the brown firms, there's the regulation, which is the emissions trading scheme, and they have to buy at least as many of these emission permits as they produce emissions. But they cannot buy and save them. So they cannot buy and save them. They just buy exactly as many as they produce, which is just a linear function of their production, essentially. And as I laid out before, sort of there's this market for the permits, and that is sort of the distinctive feature which makes a difference between the polluting firms and the non-polluting firms. Then on the household side, so they have composite habits. This matters essentially in order to match financial moments like the equity premium. Then they supply the permits, so they benefit, if you like, from these permits, and they do it in an optimal way. So this is important, and is also different from the 2 previous papers. So here, essentially, the households understand that emissions cause a damage, and they understand sort of how much it will cost them, and that's the price they charge to the firms. So they internalize it in this way, that the emissions are doing damage to the economy. So going a bit more detail into this emission pricing again, so the market for these permits. So the optimal pricing of this externality means that the social damage, the marginal social damage, is equal to the regulatory constraint. which is that they have to buy the permits. That is sort of the constraint. The firms have to buy the permits. The households suffer the social damage. On this market, they clear in the sense that this is internalized. So this emission allowance price is, in other words, is the expected discounted sum of marginal emissions of the production. So this was a bit of math, but I think now it's done. So then we built this model, but we also need to see that it makes sense given the data. So what we do, since it's a model which concerns asset pricing, we need to, well, we solve it up to third order, which allows us to capture some of these, especially asset pricing related moments, and we do method of moment matching. I mean, for the more technically versed among you, this model has 29 states doing method of moments without theoretical moments. It's not an easy task, but yeah, we wrote some codes. If you want to know more about it, let me know. Here, so the moments, this is just to say it matches fairly well. I think especially, I mean, what we're firstly concerned with is green finance. So the first one is the green equity premium, where you can see it matches relatively well. Then we have the market capitalization, which I mentioned earlier. Then the business cycle, which is also fairly standard in validating your model, as we've seen earlier. So standard deviation of GDP growth, of consumption investment, investment share. All these are replicated relatively well. And then the asset pricing part, as I was trying to highlight, since we put a focus on this here, we also try to match the equity premium, the volatility of dividends, the risk-free rate, and the long-term interest rates. And then we also have some non-targeted moments, which are related to the relative standard deviations of these returns, which are also fairly well matched. But this is just a validation exercise to show you, okay, the model makes sense. Given that you buy into the fact that the model makes sense, we can make certain statements with the model which we couldn't do if we just look at the data. So the insights we gain from working with a model is that, well, obviously this green equity premium, it varies with the price of carbon, and the price of carbon is driven essentially by the fact that there is a social damage, because the social damage then by the households, because they understand that they charge essentially the price to the firms, then sort of transmits all the way to the price of euros per ton of carbon. So what you see here below is essentially you vary the damage in the economy, and that will sort of starting here at the very left. If there's no damage in the economy, the price of carbon is zero. But then also there's no green equity premium because the returns will be exactly the same. If you go all the way, so you increase the damage parameter, emissions damage, all the way to the point where the green premium is what we observe in the data, then the price of carbon would be around 70%. It would also imply that the average cost of emissions is around 2% of output, which is higher than what it's usually calibrated in these models, but it's not unrealistic going forward, as it seems. Now, another explanation is a stigma on brown stocks. So essentially investors decide we don't want to touch brown stocks. So the way we implement it is that it's sort of a sin stock, and that has consequences for asset pricing, and results essentially in increasing the brown returns, but it also decreases the market value. And here essentially we vary sort of the aversion against these brown stocks, and as you increase it, so again on the left here, sort of there is no stigma, and then to the right we increase the stigma. So this is just to say, like, okay, is this a reasonable thing, the relationship between how much market value is lost for the brown firms compared to the green premium. And also, I mean, if you increase this return, you move away from what you observe in the data. So if you increase this parameter, you move away from what you observe in the data. So this seems to be a less likely explanation. How much time do I have left, roughly? 5 minutes, okay. So and this, maybe to the surprise of the discussant, is not in the paper, but it's actually something we worked on very recently. And I'll try to explain it. Happy to take questions on this for sure. So we tried to look at the transition to a greener economy. So what we do here is a scenario where the share of the brown sector in the final good, so if you remember, there were brown and green goods production, they were combined by the final good and then sold to the households. And we say that the share, which is 51% in the standard calibration, goes to 25%. So essentially the brown goods in this final good, they become smaller over the course of 25 years. That's the scenario here. We implement this, so this is not anticipated. Essentially, we change it linear every period, and every period, essentially, the agents in the economy wake up realizing that the world has changed, but they're still bound to the previous period states. So what you see here in blue is the transition, what will happen. What you see in black is essentially the long run equilibrium, if you like. So that is where eventually, if I would continue these charts for another 1,000 periods, it will go to the black line, essentially. So what do we see here? Actually, if we do transition by reducing the brown sector, so we don't take a stance here on how it happens. We just say, like, okay, if it happens like this, how would it play out? So we see that there is a brown premium appearing. So remember, we're talking about a green premium here in the data. But if we implement the transition this way, there's a brown premium, which is talking to exactly the literature I mentioned in the beginning, that Bolton and Koberchik were saying there is a brown premium, but it's linked to transition risk. And that will confirm exactly that, of around 5% here during the transition, but not in the long run. In the long run, you would essentially still maintain the green premium. There is, and that is something which I'm happy to discuss, it would trigger an economic boom if you transition towards a greener economy. This has two effects. One, that is a smaller one, is simply that, well, emitting is bad for the economy. So now, if there are less emissions, yeah, that's better for the economy, obviously. So this effect is playing a role, but it's playing a smaller role. The more important effect here is essentially that the economy is restructured in a way that it's more efficient to produce. So essentially, the way you produce in the economy is less complex, because the green part of the economy becomes sort of more dominant, and you don't have to sort of rely on the complex combination of brown and green goods anymore to the extent that you needed to do so before. This is the dominating effect. So it's sort of a more efficient reorganization of the economy, which leads to the economic expansion here. And then last but not least, as you see at the bottom, this is the dividends. So there's a divestment from the brown sector, which intuitively makes sense. I mean, gradually the brown sector is shrinking, so why would you invest in the brown sector? So you divest, which here is being done through dividends, so they just give back more money to the shareholders. But as the sector gets smaller, that is the black line, essentially, I mean, also just in absolute terms, the dividends shrink. And this is essentially, if you buy in that the transition is simply the brown sector becoming smaller, that's how it could play out. And that brings me to the conclusion. So We propose a mechanism to explain the green equity premium, which is the emissions trading scheme and the pro-cyclical component with it. We look at the data, which confirms these correlations implied by the mechanism. We validate, we write down a model, we validate it given the data. It implies a carbon price around 70 euros per ton. And we use this model essentially as a testing ground for further possible explanations, as you've seen.
Thank you very much, Thor. Marcos, would you like to comment?
Aqui? Excuse me. The presentation is split in 4 parts. Revise the main goals, the modeling strategies, main results, and then some questions and suggestions. The main goal is to model the green equity premium and try to answer some main question that is which factors could affect the financial results of green and brown firms. The authors incorporate a carbon market. This means that the regulation is based on emissions allowances and carbon price. And to answer how does carbon price affect financial returns, and how carbon pricing can account for these documented differences in returns that is a positive green equity premium observed in data. Then, departing from a baseline model, they incorporate some other aspects related to the preferences for green financial assets concerning equities and bonds, and try to answer how the green preferences affect financial returns. They introduce aversion for brown equities into the utility function, and try to see how brown firms' stigma affects market value and green premium. In which situations brown firms could outperform the green. In this case, we have this negative green premium, and also introduce preference, for example, in green bonds, assuming heterogeneous firms leverage, and try to show how does a higher leverage of green firms affect bond markets and the green premium. About the strategies, first of all, the authors say that firms this is the first attempt to integrate the asset price and environmental literature within the business cycle model, enabling to examine dynamics of the green and brown returns. They say that most studies rely only on leverage to provide some solution for this, what they call equity premium puzzle. This is associated to have a positive green premium data. They depart from the premise that the well-designed carbon market generates cyclical fluctuations in carbon price. Then they use they show that how emissions are influenced by economic activity, and tend to increase. This means this mechanism is related to the increase of during. We see an increase in during economic booms of the carbon price and decrease during downturns. They incorporate then the market market for emission allowances with general equilibrium framework. And then they assume that the externality takes the form of resource cost. Price and quantity of these allowances are endogenous, determined. The important hypothesis is that the allowances fully internalize the environmental externality. This implies that the price of emissions allowances is optimal. This is an important assumption in this model. This means that the social planner could not improve the allocation achieved in the centralized equilibrium. They solved the other aspect, interesting aspect, that they solved the model using third order perturbation. This is my dream, to do this with my model. But then with this, they capture asymmetries and non-linearities. Okay? Between the main results, they conclude that the carbon market could account for this positive equity premium observed in data. They show how price of carbon helps to smooth profits and dividends of brown companies, which means the costs rise in good times and decreases during recession. Then this is then reducing the procyclicality of dividends. This is a kind of anti-cyclical in terms of activity of the sector. Then this provides in terms of risk perspective, the carbon price acts as an insurance mechanism. This means that reduce the compensation demanded by investors to hold brown stocks. And other results include the inclusion of the aversion for brown financial assets. The inclusion of this kind of aversion generates offsetting effects of relative returns, depending on type of assets. An aversion for brown stocks increases the relative returns of brown with respect to green companies. And if you add a preference for green bonds, this has the opposite effect. This is the main pictures of the paper. The first one, the circle represents here the calibration at 2% of green premium with around 7% of price carbon. Then departing from this equilibrium, they show how the green premium decrease if you increase the stigma, and also shows how same green premium increase if the leverage of green companies increase. Okay. To conclude my comments. Actually, one of these comments I saw that you did this exercise about the transition effects. I will start with this last one. It's interesting to see that you did this exercise to simulate the transition effects on the economic activity. It's interesting to see the impulse responses, permanent shocks of carbon prices, green firms, and so on. Maybe it's an interesting thing to do, I think. Is to try to do some sensitivity analysis of trying to relax the optimality assumption that you impose, maybe to see the results change. For example, to see how your impulse responses are affected by some hypotheses. And maybe it's interesting to see also, I didn't see in the paper a calibration assuming stigma and assuming preferences. I don't know why if it's possible to do to calibrate the model for a 2% of green premium, assuming, because you calibrate the model assuming no stigma and no preferences. Okay, maybe it would be interesting to see other calibrations of the model, assuming that you have some kind of stigma and preferences. I don't know if you have data to do this job, but it would be interesting to see how the impulse responses are affected by relaxing these three assumptions, basically, that I mentioned. Stop here.
Laura, would you like to react?
Yeah. So thanks a lot for the comments. Much appreciated. So yeah, I mean, partially the first point is on our to-do list. I think, I mean, both of you had sort of the other standard way of including emissions, and we here, I mean, we started with this because I think it's a clean way, this way of including emissions, of highlighting our mechanism. I think the sort of the main insight will still stand, but we want to do it, and for sure it will. I mean, it's an interesting additional exercise we should do. We're aware. We will do. The second point, yeah, that's interesting because the stigma works the other way, right? With leverage, you could. So in a sense, you could generate the green premium, which is there in the data. So you could say, okay, maybe it's sort of overshooting on leverage, and then you have a bit of stigma. Data on stigma, I'm not aware of, but we need to check. Data on leverage, we did check that we have, and not sure if it was already in the paper, but we did check that, and we will include it and also include it in the calibration for the model. But it was in line with the current calibration either way. So yeah, thank you for the comments.
Any last questions for Tor? Okay, so thank you very much to all Tor, Marcus, and Lee for the great presentations and also for the discussions. I thank all of you for attending this session and hope to see you around tomorrow. Thank you very much.
I don't know, for example.